Have you ever wondered if the greatest treasure you'll ever find isn't hidden in gold, but in a promise someone kept for generations? When a 73-year-old widower spent every dollar of his pension on an abandoned lighthouse everyone believed was worthless, people thought he had lost his mind. But behind its ancient stone walls waited a forgotten vault sealed for more than 60 years, a discovery that would uncover a forgotten hero, rewrite history, and prove that sometimes God hides his greatest blessings until the right person is ready to find them. Autumn 2012. Cold Atlantic winds swept across the rocky coastline near Lubeck, Maine, while powerful waves crashed endlessly against moss-covered cliffs beneath heavy gray skies. Arthur Bennett stood quietly at the edge of the narrow stone path leading toward Gray Point Lighthouse. At 73 years old, he still carried the solid posture of a man who had spent an entire lifetime working around ships and steel, although age had slowed his steps. Standing just over 6 feet tall, Arthur possessed broad shoulders, weathered hands, and a square face marked by deep lines carved from decades of salty sea air. His neatly trimmed silver beard framed a calm but tired smile, while gentle blue-gray eyes reflected both intelligence and loneliness. Years as a naval engineer had taught him to trust careful observation more than assumptions. Machines rarely failed without leaving clues behind, and Arthur believed people often worked the same way. Since losing his wife, Eleanor, to cancer 18 months earlier, that quiet patience had become his greatest companion. For 47 years, Eleanor had been the center of his world. She had loved the sea even more than Arthur did, often telling him that every lighthouse represented hope because its purpose was never to shine for itself, but for strangers searching for safe passage. During the final weeks of her illness, she made him promise one thing. "When I'm gone," she whispered from her hospital bed, "don't spend the rest of your life waiting to join me. Go find the ocean again." Arthur never forgot those words. After her funeral, he sold the modest white house they had shared for nearly 3 decades. Friends begged him not to. His children worried he was making an emotional decision. Yet Arthur quietly combined the proceeds from the sale with nearly every dollar of his retirement pension. It was not enough to buy a comfortable waterfront home or a fishing cottage. It was only enough to purchase one property nobody else wanted: Gray Point Lighthouse. The abandoned lighthouse had stood empty for more than 60 years. There was no electricity, no running water. No road connected it to the mainland except a narrow stone causeway that disappeared beneath the Atlantic whenever high tide arrived. Structural engineers had inspected the tower several years earlier and estimated that constant storms would eventually destroy it unless someone invested enormous amounts of money into repairs. Local residents called it the last ruin. Most assumed Arthur had lost his mind. On the morning he officially received the keys, only one person bothered meeting him at the small harbor. Benjamin Carter, a 62-year-old harbor caretaker with thick white hair, sunburned skin, kind brown eyes, and a heavy canvas coat, had spent 40 years maintaining fishing docks around Lubeck. Friendly and practical, Benjamin knew nearly every family along the coastline. As he helped Arthur load supplies onto a small workboat, he hesitated before speaking. "You still have time to change your mind," Benjamin said gently. Arthur smiled. "I've spent my whole life repairing things everyone else gave up on." Benjamin looked toward the lonely lighthouse standing against the gray horizon. "I'm just not sure this one wants to be repaired." The boat crossed restless water beneath gathering clouds. As they approached Gray Point, the lighthouse tower appeared even larger than Arthur remembered. Thick granite blocks formed its circular walls, blackened by generations of Atlantic storms. Rust stained the old iron lantern room above, while broken windows stared toward the sea like empty eyes. Seabirds circled silently overhead. Benjamin unloaded the last crate before shaking Arthur's hand. "If you need anything," he said, "signal the harbor before sunset." Then he sailed away. For the first time in many years, Arthur stood completely alone. Inside, silence echoed through the stone tower. A spiral staircase climbed toward the lantern room, every iron step worn smooth by thousands of footsteps taken long before he was born. Dust covered the floor. Salt crystals clung to the walls. The entire building smelled of damp stone, old timber, and forgotten history. Arthur unpacked slowly, studying every detail as any engineer would. He tapped the granite walls with his flashlight, listening carefully to the sound each section produced. Most echoed with the solid confidence expected from massive stone construction. One section did not. Near the base of the spiral staircase, Arthur noticed a faint difference in the masonry. Several granite blocks were cut with extraordinary precision, unlike the surrounding walls. Curious, he knelt and brushed decades of dust from the floor. Something appeared beneath the dirt. A symbol. It had been carved directly into the stone foundation. A compass rose enclosed within a six-pointed star. Arthur's heartbeat stopped. He had seen that symbol only once before. 40 years earlier, inside his late father's weathered maritime journal. His father, Samuel Bennett, had never explained what the strange mark meant. Whenever Arthur asked, Samuel simply smiled and replied, "Some maps are drawn on paper. Others are hidden in places only time remembers." Arthur slowly rested one hand upon the ancient carving. Outside, Atlantic waves thundered against the cliffs. Inside the abandoned lighthouse, a forgotten mystery quietly awakened for the first time in more than half a century. Several weeks passed as Arthur Bennett slowly restored the lower levels of Gray Point Lighthouse. Autumn storms rolled in one after another, sending towering waves crashing against the granite cliffs. Whenever high tide isolated the lighthouse from the mainland, Arthur worked alone beneath the tower, clearing broken beams, removing decades of damp debris, and carefully inspecting the aging stonework. The mysterious symbol beneath the spiral staircase never left his thoughts. More than once he compared it with sketches from Samuel Bennett's maritime journal, becoming increasingly convinced that his father had known far more about Gray Point than he had ever admitted. One rainy afternoon, while replacing rotted wooden supports in the basement, Arthur noticed an unusual draft of cold air slipping through a narrow crack between two massive granite blocks. Years spent repairing naval vessels had sharpened his instincts for hidden compartments and structural irregularities. He tapped the wall with a steel hammer. Most of the stones answered with the deep, solid sound of thick masonry. One section produced a hollow echo. His pulse quickened. Working patiently over several hours, Arthur removed layers of crumbling mortar that someone had carefully applied decades earlier. Finally, one granite block shifted slightly. Hidden behind the false wall stood a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron straps. Rust covered the hinges, yet the craftsmanship remained remarkably strong. After forcing the swollen door open, Arthur raised his lantern and stepped inside. The room was not a treasure vault. There were no gold coins, no jewels, no stacks of money. Instead, shelves filled every wall from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of leather-bound journals rested beside carefully rolled nautical charts. Weather logs, lighthouse maintenance records, coded telegrams, rescue reports, hand-drawn sea current maps, and thick navigation books had all been arranged with extraordinary care. The air smelled of old paper, salt, cedar wood, and lamp oil. Somehow the sealed chamber had remained almost perfectly dry for more than 60 years. On a large wooden desk rested a brass nameplate. Captain Nathaniel Cross. Arthur carefully opened the first journal. The elegant handwriting belonged to the final lighthouse keeper before Gray Point officially closed in 1951. Old photographs tucked between the pages revealed Nathaniel as a man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair, piercing gray eyes, and a lean face weathered by decades of Atlantic storms. His neatly trimmed beard and perfectly pressed lighthouse uniform reflected a disciplined personality shaped by military service during World War II. Those who had written about him described him as quiet, deeply honorable, and stubborn whenever lives at sea were at risk. He rarely sought recognition, believing that a lighthouse keeper's greatest success was remaining invisible while others returned safely home. Night after night, Arthur read Nathaniel's journals beside the fireplace. One entry immediately captured his attention. While studying tides after the war, Nathaniel had discovered a narrow offshore current hidden between dangerous reefs. Ships that followed the passage could avoid both violent storms and submerged rock formations that had claimed countless vessels over previous generations. Nathaniel believed the route could save thousands of sailors. He reported everything: charts, measurements, current speeds, seasonal variations. The response shocked him. Military officials classified the entire discovery, arguing that the passage held strategic importance during the early Cold War. Every original chart was confiscated. Nathaniel was ordered never to discuss the route publicly. Gray Point Lighthouse gradually lost its importance. Funding disappeared. The lighthouse closed. Nathaniel retired quietly, carrying the burden of a forgotten achievement no one would ever acknowledge. Near the end of the final journal, Arthur found a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finally opens this room." Inside lay only a single handwritten page. "If you are reading this, then time has succeeded where I could not. I never wanted fame. I only wanted the truth to survive long enough for someone brave enough to protect it. Please let the sea remember what history chose to forget." Arthur lowered the letter slowly. Outside, fog drifted across the Atlantic while waves pounded the cliffs exactly as they had when Nathaniel wrote those words more than 60 years earlier. At that moment, Arthur finally understood. Gray Point Lighthouse had never been abandoned. It had been faithfully guarding someone else's unfinished story until the day the right caretaker finally arrived. Winter slowly gave way to early spring along the rugged coast of Maine. Dense fog drifted across the Atlantic each morning before giving way to pale sunlight that shimmered upon the restless sea. Gray Point Lighthouse, once forgotten by almost everyone, had suddenly become the center of national attention. Arthur Bennett never expected his discovery to reach beyond the small fishing communities surrounding Lubeck. Yet within weeks, historians, maritime archaeologists, professors, museum curators, and officers from the United States Coast Guard arrived almost daily. The journals of Captain Nathaniel Cross challenged long-accepted accounts of coastal navigation after World War II. University researchers carefully photographed every page, while preservation experts cataloged each weather log and rescue report before time could damage them further. Among the visitors was Commander Rebecca Hayes, a 48-year-old Coast Guard historian assigned to preserve America's maritime heritage. Rebecca stood nearly 5 feet 9, with an athletic build developed through years at sea. Her short dark hair had begun showing strands of silver around her temples, while sharp green eyes reflected quiet determination. Calm under pressure and deeply respectful toward history, she believed forgotten records often carried lessons modern technology overlooked. After reviewing Nathaniel's journals for 3 days, she approached Arthur with visible admiration. "Captain Cross may have saved far more lives than anyone realized," she said softly. "History simply forgot to thank him." News coverage spread quickly across New England. With attention came opportunity. A wealthy coastal development corporation soon contacted Arthur. Its president, Charles Whitmore, arrived aboard a polished black SUV accompanied by architects and financial advisors. Charles was 61 years old, tall, impeccably dressed, with neatly styled silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and a confident smile polished by decades of multi-million-dollar negotiations. He had built luxury resorts along the East Coast and believed every abandoned property represented untapped profit. Unlike Arthur, Charles measured value through investment potential rather than history. Standing atop the lighthouse cliffs, Charles presented his proposal. "I'll offer $30 million for the entire property," he said. He unfolded elegant architectural drawings showing luxury hotels, private villas, restaurants, and a helicopter landing area overlooking the Atlantic. The lighthouse can become the centerpiece. Arthur quietly studied the plans before folding them closed. "This place already has a purpose." Charles smiled politely. It had one. Arthur looked toward the ocean. "It still does." The answer never changed. He refused every offer. Weeks later, archaeological surveys began searching for additional structural features mentioned inside Nathaniel's journals. Ground-penetrating radar detected an unusually dense steel object hidden beneath the lighthouse foundation. Engineers carefully removed centuries-old stone flooring, exposing an enormous circular steel hatch almost completely concealed beneath granite slabs. Excitement spread instantly. Reporters gathered outside the lighthouse. Some speculated about pirate treasure. Others predicted stacks of wartime gold or priceless artifacts. Television helicopters circled overhead as restoration crews slowly unlocked the corroded steel mechanism. When the vault finally opened, complete silence filled the underground chamber. There was no treasure, no jewels, no gold. Instead, rows of beautifully preserved navigation instruments rested exactly where Nathaniel had left them. Original brass sextants, signal lanterns, foghorn control systems, magnetic compasses, radio transmitters, lighthouse communication equipment, and precision navigation devices lined custom-built cabinets. Nearby stood shelves containing more than 2,000 detailed meteorological records documenting Atlantic storms, tides, currents, temperatures, and visibility conditions across several decades. Every rescue operation Gray Point had coordinated was recorded in extraordinary detail, including handwritten accounts of ships guided safely through violent hurricanes and winter blizzards. Commander Rebecca carefully lifted one weather log. Her voice almost trembled. Modern forecasting models are missing observations like these. Marine scientists quickly realized the collection represented one of the most complete historical coastal weather archives ever discovered along the northeastern United States. Rescue historians estimated that Nathaniel's hidden navigation route and meticulous forecasting records had quietly contributed to saving hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of sailors over generations. Arthur stood silently inside the vault. People had come searching for treasure. Instead, they had uncovered something far more valuable: knowledge, compassion, and the life work of a man who never cared whether history remembered his name, so long as strangers returned safely home. As sunlight streamed through the open hatch above, Arthur smiled quietly. The greatest vault beneath Gray Point Lighthouse had never protected wealth. It had protected wisdom powerful enough to save lives long after its creator was gone. Summer arrived along the rocky coast of Maine, and for the first time in generations, Gray Point Lighthouse no longer stood as a forgotten ruin. The sound of hammers echoed where silence had ruled for decades, while fishing boats passing offshore slowed to watch scaffolding rise around the old granite tower. What had once been dismissed as a collapsing relic was slowly becoming a symbol of hope again. Arthur Bennett never imagined spending his retirement directing restoration crews. At 74, his hands remained rough from years of engineering work, but now they carried blueprints instead of tools. Every donation, every grant, and nearly every dollar from the legal compensation offered after the historical discoveries went directly back into the lighthouse. Friends questioned his decision. "You've earned the right to enjoy life," Benjamin Carter reminded him one afternoon. Arthur smiled as he watched craftsmen repair the lantern room. "I am enjoying it." Supported by local volunteers, universities, the Coast Guard, and maritime museums, Gray Point Lighthouse officially became the Gray Point Maritime Museum and Coastal Weather Research Center. Researchers carefully preserved Nathaniel Cross's journals inside climate-controlled archives, while engineers restored the original navigation equipment exactly as it had appeared during the lighthouse's final years of operation. Visitors soon arrived from across the country, not searching for hidden treasure, but to learn how one forgotten lighthouse had quietly protected countless lives. Arthur believed the discovery deserved to inspire future generations rather than simply preserve the past. Together with Commander Rebecca Hayes and several community leaders, he established the Nathaniel Cross Foundation, a scholarship program supporting students pursuing maritime navigation, oceanography, coastal engineering, marine conservation, and search and rescue service. The foundation awarded its very first scholarship to Emily Carter. Emily was 18 years old, the daughter of a struggling fishing family from Lubeck. She was slender, with long chestnut hair usually tied into a simple braid, clear blue eyes, lightly freckled skin, and the quiet confidence often found in young people raised beside the sea. Storms had shaped much of her childhood. Several poor fishing seasons had pushed her family close to bankruptcy, and college had become little more than an impossible dream. Yet Emily had graduated at the top of her class, while volunteering with local emergency rescue teams every weekend. Compassion came naturally to her. Whenever storms struck the Maine coast, she was always among the first to help distribute supplies or assist stranded fishermen. When Arthur handed her the scholarship certificate during the foundation's opening ceremony, he noticed something familiar. She possessed the same calm determination he had seen inside Nathaniel's journals. "I hope you'll do more than study the sea," Arthur told her quietly. "I hope you'll protect the people who depend on it." Emily smiled. "I promise." Years passed. The scholarship allowed Emily to attend the United States Coast Guard Academy, where she graduated with distinction before returning to New England as a Coast Guard officer specializing in maritime search and rescue. Whenever interviews praised her achievements, she always mentioned the forgotten lighthouse that had changed her future before she had ever stepped inside a classroom. Meanwhile, restoration of Gray Point reached its final stage. On a calm September evening, hundreds of local residents gathered along the cliffs. Fishing boats floated offshore, their decks crowded with families. Children sat on their parents' shoulders while elderly fishermen removed their caps in respectful silence. As twilight settled across the Atlantic, Arthur climbed the spiral staircase one final time. The original brass lantern mechanism, carefully restored by preservation engineers, stood exactly where Nathaniel Cross had once tended it every evening. Arthur rested one weathered hand upon the polished control wheel. For a brief moment, he imagined Nathaniel standing beside him, not asking for recognition, only asking that the light continue. Arthur slowly activated the restored beacon. A brilliant white beam swept across the dark Atlantic for the first time in more than 60 years. Cheers rose from the shoreline. Fishing boats sounded their horns. Many in the crowd quietly wiped away tears. Arthur looked toward the endless ocean. The greatest miracle had never been discovering a hidden vault. It was watching forgotten light guide people home once again. 10 years passed, and Gray Point Lighthouse no longer resembled the forgotten ruin that Arthur Bennett had first crossed the tide to purchase. Every summer, hundreds of thousands of visitors traveled from across the United States and beyond to stand upon the granite cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. School children toured the Maritime Museum. Historians studied Captain Nathaniel Cross's journals. Coast Guard cadets paused quietly before the restored rescue equipment that had once protected generations of sailors. Gray Point had become one of Maine's most treasured historical landmarks, not because of hidden wealth, but because it reminded people that quiet acts of courage could outlast entire lifetimes. At 84 years old, Arthur moved with the slow confidence of a man who no longer measured life by speed. His silver beard had turned completely white, and the deep lines across his weathered face had softened rather than hardened him. His blue-gray eyes still reflected the sea each morning, but the loneliness that had followed Eleanor's passing had gradually been replaced by gratitude. Every sunrise, before the museum opened, Arthur climbed the spiral staircase alone to inspect the lantern room. He no longer climbed because anyone expected him to. He climbed because the light had become part of his daily prayer. Although the foundation now employed professional curators, engineers, and historians, Arthur refused every offer to move into a comfortable retirement home. He continued living inside the small keeper's quarters where Captain Nathaniel Cross had once spent countless nights watching storms roll across the Atlantic. The modest room contained little more than a wooden bed, a bookshelf, Eleanor's framed photograph, Samuel Bennett's old maritime journal, and a simple oak desk overlooking the sea. One object always drew visitors' attention. Hanging inside a plain wooden frame above Arthur's desk was the faded purchase receipt showing the exact amount of money he had paid for Gray Point Lighthouse using nearly every dollar of his retirement pension. People smiled whenever they noticed it. Almost every afternoon someone asked the same question. "Mr. Bennett, do you ever regret spending your entire pension on an abandoned lighthouse?" Arthur never answered immediately. Instead, he looked through the office window toward the beam of light sweeping across the Atlantic. Then he smiled. "I never bought a lighthouse." The visitors usually laughed politely, believing he was joking. Arthur gently shook his head. "I believe God simply guided me to a legacy the world had forgotten." Silence almost always followed. Many expected him to speak about the hidden vault. Others assumed he meant the museum. But Arthur always continued. The journals, the weather records, the rescue equipment, those were never the real treasure. He rested one hand upon Nathaniel Cross's final letter. The treasure was the truth, the courage to protect it, and ordinary people willing to keep its light burning for someone they would never meet. One autumn afternoon, Arthur attended another Nathaniel Cross Foundation scholarship ceremony. Among the speakers stood Lieutenant Emily Carter, now a respected Coast Guard rescue officer whose calm leadership had already saved dozens of fishermen during severe Atlantic storms. Watching her encourage the next generation of students, Arthur quietly realized that Nathaniel's legacy had continued far beyond the walls of Gray Point. The lighthouse was no longer preserving history. It was creating it. That evening, after the last visitors departed, Arthur climbed to the lantern room one final time before sunset. The restored beacon slowly rotated above him exactly as it had decades earlier. Far below, fishing boats returned safely toward the harbor while children waved from the museum grounds. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. He silently thanked Eleanor for sending him back to the sea. He thanked his father for leaving behind questions instead of answers. He thanked Captain Nathaniel Cross for trusting that someday a stranger would care enough to finish what he had begun. As darkness settled over the Atlantic, the brilliant white beams stretched endlessly across the water. Arthur finally understood. The greatest things God preserves are rarely treasures buried beneath stone. They are acts of faith, courage, and truth, carefully protected across generations until the right hearts are ready to carry the light forward. Sometimes God's greatest miracles are not hidden in vaults filled with gold. Sometimes they are hidden inside forgotten acts of courage, quiet faith, and truths that wait patiently for the right person to uncover them. Arthur believed he was spending his pension on an abandoned lighthouse. But God had preserved something far more valuable there for more than 60 years, a legacy that would inspire generations, save lives, and remind the world that even forgotten places can shine again. In our own lives, we often face seasons when our efforts seem unnoticed and our dreams feel forgotten. But God is always working beyond what we can see. The kindness you show today, the truth you choose to protect, or the sacrifice you make for someone else may become a light that guides people you will never even meet. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith, hope, and God's amazing grace. May God bless you, your family, and everyone you love. May His light always guide your path and bring peace to your heart. Amen.